Do we have any scientific evidence that our consciousness exists outside our physical bodies?
Yeah, we do. In many near-death experiences, people say they left their bodies and they saw things from an out-of-body perspective that they couldn't possibly have seen. Let me give you an example of this. One fellow I knew was a 55-year-old truck driver he had crushing chest pain, rushed to the hospital, and they did an evaluation and found he had 4 vessels on his heart that were clogged. So he was rushed to the operating room for quadruple bypass surgery. In the middle of the operation, he told me, he saw his surgeon. He looked down from above, saw his body on the operating table, and saw his surgeon flapping his arms like he was trying to fly. Now, at this point, I've been a doctor for 30 years. I'd never heard anything so ridiculous in my life. So I thought he was hallucinating, but he insisted it was real. So a few days after his operation, with his permission, in fact, with his insistence, I went to talk to his surgeon. I asked him about it. And the surgeon kind of sheepishly said, well, yeah, I did do that. I was letting my assistants start the operation while I put on my sterile gloves and gown and went into the operating room and watched them start the operation. And I didn't want to risk touching anything that wasn't sterile, so I put my hands where I knew they wouldn't touch anything, flat against my chest. And then I pointed things out to them with my elbows so I wouldn't touch anything with my fingers. And he demonstrated just like the patient did. Now, that's not something the patient could have guessed, not something you see doctors on TV doing. So I don't know how he could have known that. And I've heard that from time after time after time from different experiencers, that they saw things accurately from an out-of-body perception. So we have lots of evidence from near-death experiences that our consciousness is not necessarily tied to the body. This is not a new idea. Hippocrates wrote about this 2,000 years ago. And in fact, we have evidence from other things besides near-death experiences that the mind and the brain are not the same. Now, in everyday life, it seems like they are. When you get drunk, you don't think very clearly. When you get hit on the head or have a stroke, that affects your thinking. But in extreme circumstances like near-death experiences, the mind and the brain seem to separate. Another example is something called terminal lucidity, in which people who have end-stage dementia like Alzheimer's disease and have not been able to communicate coherently or recognize family for months or sometimes years suddenly become totally lucid again and can recognize people, carry on coherent conversations, and then shortly after that they die, often within hours. And we have no medical explanation for that. You don't regenerate a brain with Alzheimer's disease, and yet it happens. And the explanation seems to me to be that when the brain deteriorates enough, it loosens its hold on the mind, and then you can have this separation take place.
I found that so fascinating, both in your book and just other, resources researching for this episode, because especially when it came to the John Hopkins studies done about for psychedelic research, because you would think that would, light up the brain,
Right.
And they found, you would obviously be better at explaining this than I am, but I think you know what I'm referring to, where the quieting of the brain, for lack of a better way to explain that, it heightens this other lesser study, harder to measure aspect of it.
Right. We always assume that psychedelic drugs work by stimulating the brain to hallucinate. But work done at Johns Hopkins with psilocybin and at Imperial College in London have consistently shown that the more elaborate mystical experiences with psychedelic drugs are associated with a decrease in brain activity and a decrease in the connection between different parts of the brain. Almost as if, again, the brain is loosening its hold on the mind so that it can experience all these things.
Aren't humans incredible? Doesn't it just, researching all this, just make you feel like we're such a mystery? We think we know so much, but we really don't. And it's kind of exciting. I loved what you quoted in the book. It was science historian Thomas Kuhn, and he said, "Scientific advances come about when a new fact is discovered that can't be explained."
Exactly.
And when you shared the story about the woman and your spaghetti stain on your tie and the man observing himself in surgery, I was thinking about those again, running them through my brain and realizing that these were not near-death experiences in a sense because they weren't dead. But when I went down the rabbit hole of research, I learned that this was called astral projection. And then that led me to the CIA's report. What was it called? They just released a report just saying that they were studying the phenomenon for altered state of conscious for the purpose of psychic spying during the Cold War. And I forget what the name of the report is, but have you have any insight into this particular feature of the experiences that you've collected?
Yeah, the military, they call this project the Stargate Project. And they actually trained some people on how to leave their bodies and view things from at a distant location. So they could sort of spy on, at this time it was the Russians. And they had some success in that, but they ultimately decided, if you can believe what their report says, that it wasn't accurate enough to keep funding. So they stopped doing the research into that, if you believe the reports.
You've said that twice, so you don't believe the report.
I don't know.
Well, it's a fascinating area, and there's, I think, a school that studies this as well.
There are many schools that study this. My university, University of Virginia, is the only one that has an academic group in a medical school that's devoted to studying this. But there are independent schools all over the world that study astral projection or other phenomena like that.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible, but hard to measure. And so I am curious about your thoughts of measurement tools. How do you measure scientifically these cases, and what tools of measurement do you feel like the future may have? Maybe you've heard someone's working on that would be really helpful for getting more data around and measuring around these sorts of things.
Well, we started studying this phenomenon, near-death experiences, by just collecting stories. And that's really how all science starts. You collect anecdotes, and then you find patterns when you get enough of them. So we looked at patterns that were consistent across cultures, people in different religions, different cultures, different centuries. And we found a lot of consistent features that were the same among near-death experiences, no matter where you were, no matter what you believed. Things like leaving the body, having a tremendous sense of overwhelming peace and well-being, going through a tunnel to some other non-physical realm, encountering other entities that you may interpret as being gods or deceased loved ones. And these are consistent across cultures. So we developed a scale to measure this. And we have applied that to thousands and thousands of people. It's been translated into 20 different languages now and used around the world. And that's a basic tool for studying the near-death experience. Now we can then correlate the scores on this scale with physiological things going on in the body and in the brain at the time of the experience, or with the after effects, how this experience changes people's lives. And for me as a psychiatrist, that's one of the most important parts of this feature, of this experience. People are never the same after a near-death experience.
And you're being humble. You said we created a scale. I know you created the scale.
Yes.
And I know people call it the Greyson scale, but you don't care for that. You call it the NDE scale, correct?
Right.
Yes.
Right.
But I love how the NDE scale, from what you just described, it sounds a lot like scales for measuring like depression and things that you can't literally take a tape measure to, but you measure the features. Is that kind of how you got inspired to set up those measurements?
Right. As a psychiatrist, I'm familiar with these scales for measuring emotional states like depression and anxiety, and I've kind of modeled it after that.
Hey, you're still here. That's awesome. I hope to see you next week too. I talk with the most interesting people that you've probably never heard of. Most of them are paradoxical and bring an opportunity for you to grow as a person. So if you like bright, meaningful entertainment, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications.